morning, really to wake up, to think and be grateful. We all made it here safe to this Monday morning. And, you know, I like to take the mindset calls that we have and inspired by either people in the mastermind or events that we've all gone through. Um, and that is, this weekend we had Father's Day, and we celebrate Mother's Day, and then when it comes to Father's Day, a lot of times I like to say that there's lessons that we learn and gain, and for me it was a peaceful day. Spent it, with one of the kids, and it was really a time I think about, um, the philosophies that we pass on to our kids, and think about the lessons that we learn. And one of the perspectives that I have, let me share my screen. One of the perspectives that I see out there is that, a lot of times until you become a father, you really, you really can't prepare for it or really truly understand, uh, you know, the responsibility and then also the love. Um, and in trading, a lot of people can talk about being a successful trader or what it takes, but you really don't truly understand what it is to be a trader until you get there. You really don't understand to be a father and a mother until you actually get there. And this is we can kind of plan for change. You can get the house ready. You expect a new baby, you prepare for it, but there's nothing, there's no real joy that you can kind of prepare for it until you are experiencing it. And that is the same that we apply to trading. We can tell you what it feels like to be a successful trader, but it is actually a process. It's actually walking through it and experiencing it. And so, this is, sequences that, from going from a boy to a man, a woman, or a girl to a woman, a girl to a mother. It is a process that you experience, and you don't bring your old self. At some point, you go through a transformation process, right? And being a father, you have a kid, but over a period of time, right? You kind of transform and evolve. And it's the same thing where you can't think of you can't think of what it's going to feel like or be to be a father the same way you can't think and feel like what it's going to feel like to be successful in trading. It just happens. And there's no amount of thinking that you can kind of imagine. It's more of, what you do. And so, um, you know, you try to, um, evaluate the after using the before, but there's really no way to evaluate who you become uh, prior to becoming, right? And so, like I say, the man without a trillion to ask, well, I still get to do what I love. And from inside his current self, the answer is terrifying, and so you hesitate, right? Like I don't know if I'm ready to be a father, or I don't know if I'm ready to be X, Y, Z, right? Because you can't really see it until you experience it, and you see the responsibility, right? Oh man, I have to take care of another person. I have to make more money, etc. Where there's also a new set of um, motivations, right? A new set of responsibility, and that new set of motivation and new set of responsibility actually motivates you and actually push you forward. Sets a new standard for yourself, right? Like before, a man would just want money, but after kids, you almost want a legacy. You want to pour in the effort to see, um, how impactful and how good your kids will turn out. The same way that a person becomes a trader, and they initially wants the money. Oh man, I want to make a lot of money. I want to be successful. but then it turns into, oh man, I've gotten more discipline. I've gotten a new set of friends. I've actually, modified your lifestyle, right? And all this happens in the transformation process, right? The same thing that you have a new set of preferences, right? It's just like, being a trader, nobody could have told me that, man, a lot of things I don't have in common, with a lot of my old friends because we don't have the same interests. I'd rather talk to market, or, they tell me they get days off and they're gonna take a vacation on this weekend, and it's like there's a totally different lifestyle. I think about where can I trade, in the morning, or, being available, right? It's like, well, no matter where I go, I still can have a couple hours in the morning, right? And I'm still gonna want to prepare at night. And so there's a transformation that happens, right? And there's a uh, cost benefit, right? That gets replaced by the experience, right? Now I have no interest in watching a day full of sports on a Sunday, right? Whereas I'd rather be preparing for the market. I'd rather be on a call on Sunday night than watching a football game, because I feel like the cost of preparing, is gonna further my life and my goals, and you know uh, help me in fatherhood, or help me with the goals. So, from the inside, from a reactive mind, you know, boredom sounds like punishment. From a sitting there and not doing anything sounds like punishment when I can be getting prepared. And right in other places, someone saying that, oh man, you sit in the house all day on a Sunday, it's sunny outside, right? That almost becomes a peace. Like, yeah, I just want some peace and quiet so I can actually go through my process, right? And that is the quiet confidence of a professional who knows the edge is already in the process. So, the not wanting to go out, or the father that's preparing and reading before he goes to sleep, right? That is part of the process. The father that wants to be a good example, or, show, like for me, I realize I take pride in, hey, I'm at home and able to, prepare, and they see me working, uh, preparing for the market, which is work, instead of me having to leave and go somewhere. Um, and that is, you know, the insight that they're getting, the inside of, what it takes. Not that, hey, dad doesn't work, but the type of work he does, is different. And it's the same thing with, the type of parent you become when you have more time, right? And this is, you have a picture of yourself before and you have yourself after. Now, what if, you could picture yourself, like if I said, hey, what is the picture after you become a successful trader? What does it look like? What does it look like now, and what will it look like after? Right. The same way that a single guy looks at his life and says, hey, what does life look like now without kids, and what does it look like with kids? Right. Sometime a person will imagine his life will be a lot different with kids, and they'll look at all the obstacles and negative, or, oh man, I'm not gonna be able to leave, I'm not gonna be able to go to the gym, I'm not gonna be able to do XYZ. And in reality, it's like, man, I'll have all these new experiences. I'll get to do, you know, I'll get to have Disneyland trips, or I'll get to have my kids on Father's Day celebrate XYZ. It's kind of hardly rarely thought of, when a person envisions what it looks like, or a man, what it looks like when he has kids. And so the fatherhood turns into something different. The same way that you're trading, looking at your life, after I become a successful trader, what would it look like, right? Sometimes the discipline, or being able to travel, and being able to, lock in on a Sunday afternoon, right? You may not imagine that or picture that, right? And the same thing, the before and the after, right? The fatherhood, the trading, sobriety, right? Marriage, right? I definitely drank a lot more before I became a trader. Right? I definitely drank a lot more before I became a father. right? And that wasn't one of the things that, you know, I envisioned that, hey, when you have kids or you become a trader, you won't drink as much or you won't, um, that's part of the transformation, right? And that's part of the forge, right? Some things cannot be shortcutted and cannot be bought, right? They only can be lived, right? And that is part of the transformation that we go through as traders or becoming successful or becoming parents or becoming fathers, becoming mothers, right? You can't buy that experience of what it looks like for you in the future. It only can be lived. And that is the anatomy of a shift, right? That is one of the things that as a father and as a trader, we experience a shift, right? And there's a catalyst, right? It's an event that forces you into reality where the old habits no longer work, right? The old habits of me hanging out or, you know, turning up every night, right? Going to happy hour, right? It no longer works for me as a father, and it no longer works for me as a trader. And so the trader is born, the father is born, right? Um, right. There's events that happen, right? For a trader, it says that, the first time you blow account or blow in a relationship, or, the first time you doubt and think that, hey, this is not working out, right? I'm running out of time, I'm running out of money, right? That catalyst is not the disaster, it becomes the doorway. It becomes the first emission of, man, I actually want to be a trader, right? Or, I have to transform, I have to change, right? The first time that, you had a responsibility of, man, my kid is born and what type of father I want to be. That becomes a catalyst of change. And so, the anatomy of trading and fatherhood, right? We celebrate a Father's Day, right? And every trader experiences a trading day, right? A day that they said, hey, you know what? I'm gonna have to make some changes if I want to be a trader. And it comes after, sometimes blown accounts, blown relationships, right? The up at night thinking like, damn, like, whatever I'm doing right now, I have to make some changes. And then you go through the friction phase, right? When things feel hard and it feels impossible, right? Exhausted. I know some people are here on this call, they got 4 and 5 kids. There's some time where they experience friction, right? It wasn't, just as easy, having the kids cry, having to be able to be in 3 or 4 different places at one time, right? And also still be the same, right? Those times where I would get calls from my friends and as a trader and as a parent, hey man, we going here, we gonna do this, and you had to make a decision. It's like, man, I can't go out all weekend, or I can't, just come hang out, right? I gotta be a father, or I gotta be a trader, right? There is a time where the bachelor mindset, you start to have that friction of like, man, I can't be this old person that I was. I gotta make a change, right? And for a trader, they said, "Oh, you know what? Well, I'm gonna trade tomorrow," but you know that you got home late and you weren't unprepared, and you wake up early in the morning and you try to trade, and you know that, hey, that's a gambler's mindset, right? That's a person that is undisciplined and just jumping in, right? And that becomes a brutal place, right? Because at some point you're gonna know that, man, I can't hang out all night, or I can't neglect, my kids or my house and still consider myself a good parent or consider myself a good trader, right? And that becomes a friction phase, right? And that is also the ending of the old self and starting to begin the transformation of the new. You have this catalyst, you have this friction phase, then you surrender and you start adapting, right? You start negotiating with reality. You realize that, oh man, I can't drink all night and then trade and be successful, or I can't hang out and be gone for days at a time and have a kid and say I'm a good father, right? I stopped trying to bend the market and saying, well, I can just do what I want and it still works out, right? Or I can, just be my old self, and my kids are gonna look at me like a great parent, which sometimes it doesn't work out that way, right? And so you have to start building new internal rules that actually demands and match the demands of the new world, right? Your new self, right? And so a new father, just the same way as a new mother, goes through a lot of transformation, right? A new trader and experienced trader, they also go through a big transformation, right? It doesn't matter if you try harder, right? Eventually, you have to stop becoming who you were, right? In all scenarios, in these cases, that's part of the transformation. Is you realize you're gonna have to adapt and become someone different than who you were, and that is hard for some people to realize that, oh man, I'm not a single father, or I'm not a single guy no more. I'm a father. Oh, I'm not just a worker anymore. I'm a trader. I'm an entrepreneur, right? And then that becomes the shift, right? That becomes now your baseline nature. It's like, you know what, traders wake up early. You know what, traders, they prepare. You know what, you know, I don't have to try to be patient. I don't have to try to be disciplined. If I'm going to be a trader, I'm going to be patient. I'm going to be disciplined. That's required, right? Being a good father requires you to wake up and be at home, right? It requires you to spend time with the kids, right? And so, um, it's simply who you become, right? The shift just happens, right? Because the discipline and the patience and the love, right? You start, um, you're not in self denial, right? You know that, hey, a trader that wakes up, a trader that prepares on Sunday, that's just a trader. That's what traders do, right? The guy that trades, prepares and gets up early in the morning. That's what traders do, right? The guy that makes sacrifices for their kids, and whether you have a lot of money or not a lot of money, but you let your kids eat first, or you make sacrifices. That's what fathers do, right? It's nothing to get awarded by, or saying that, hey, the old self is changing. It is the transformation that happens, and we call that the fatherhood paradigm, right? And fatherhood is one of the gold standards of transformative experiences, right? It rewrites a man's entire psychological architecture, right? And you have to show up dimension by dimension, right? And so I went through a before and after, before the self-centric process, and then after the legacy, because a guy in the beginning starts off as, man, I just want to have this, I want to have the money, I want to have X, Y, Z, and that's why he's a young guy, right? In the time horizon, the short term, immediate gratification, right? You go turn up on the weekend, you go to a club, you may meet somebody, right? You have everything is, you know, um, before fatherhood is self centered, right? And after, you start thinking about generational, you start thinking about building a foundation, right? You start thinking about, man, how do I want to be remembered when I die, right? How do I want my kids to operate in the world if I'm not here, right? And it's almost a switch, right? And it's the same thing for a trader. Initially they want to make a bunch of money in the beginning, et cetera, and then they saying that, hey, you know what, I want to do this for a lifestyle. I want to actually share and change my you know future generations with the opportunity to stay at home and do the things they love. And so before you have the ego and identity, right? My pride and desire sets the temperature of the room. Things I want as a man, as the main person making all the money. And then it's the right. You know what? I'm willing to give up my ego. Right. I want to be a good father. I want to be present. I'm trying to support and help them live their best dream instead of, hey, this is about myself. Now it becomes about them. Right. And this is the before and after when it comes to fatherhood. Right. The chaos tolerance. A lot of times as a parent, we just want to get our kids, man, be quiet, don't complain, etc. Now, after when you become a good father, a good parent, you stay calm. right? And you understand that they're crying for a reason. And this is a time that you comfort, right? Before, fatherhood and trading, you just want to accumulate wealth. I want to be able to travel the world. I want to go here. I want to do that. And then, after, you have the vision of like, man, I want my kids to be taken care of. I want them to have the freedom. I want them to have the tools, right, that they can do the things that they want in life, even if it's not trading, right? And so the things that felt hard at the beginning and sacred, um, self-centered, right? That becomes the friction that happens when we say, "Hey, we're a father," or "Hey, we're a trader," right? The old self starts to die, and you transform into a better, right? You discover, the patience, the discipline, the courage, the love, right? You all experience that after, the event, and you start transforming, right? Fatherhood doesn't just make you a dad; it makes you a more complete man, a sharper, stronger version of yourself. For a trader, it also mimics fatherhood. In the beginning, the market humbles you, and sometimes brutally, and you may have tears, right? They're attacking your ego. It forces you to grow up, or it forces you to quit, right? It's two things that happen to a trader. Two minds that happen, right? And it happens for a trader as well, the same way the transformation happens, right? You start before you have a reactive mind. You see everything moving in the market and you react, right? You believe that you may not have enough indicators, that you had the wrong strategy, right? Green days you feel like a genius. The red days you feel like it tricked you. It was a trap, right? And then after you have a systematic mind, you know that the market isn't a opponent, right? It's just the relationship with uncertainty, right? You accept that you only can control your perception and your behavior, right? Your boredom replaces anxiety. Like you're not no longer have anxiety when you think about the market. You think about, all right, I gotta just be bored and I have to be at peace, right? A loss in trading after you become a trader is just a business expense. It's not. It doesn't mean that, hey, you know what, I'm a terrible trader. My strategy doesn't work. It just means that, hey, you lose some trades. So there's a trader paradigm that also goes on, and we see the change happening. So, um, the change of becoming a gambler in the market and becoming an operator, right? You're executing your edge over 1,000 of events, right? The after trader is a father who no longer resents the 3 a.m. feeding, right? The trader, some fathers, when they first have a kid, they resent, man, I gotta wake up early in the morning, the kid's always crying, etc. And then it becomes to, right, I want my kid to be comfortable when they sleep. I don't want, they're crying for a reason. I want them to have the things they want, right? That is part of the transformation of a father resenting the cries in the middle of the night to, at this point, I take offense if my daughter doesn't call me if something happens. If she, needs, if something happens and she calls someone else, right? Even as a father at this point, and she's grown, it's like almost like, hey, why didn't you call me, right? Whereas when they first are born, you're like, yeah, man, you can't. I just hope they sleep through the night. And then at some point in a father's transformation, you want to be the person that's get called at the middle of the night, right? And that is part of the crossing over, right? At some point, a person like, oh man, sorry, I can't go out tomorrow. I can't go do this. And then it becomes a point as a trader that, man, I don't want to go out tomorrow night. I want to, looking at the hotel room, I'm going to Vegas with my daughter's dance. And I'm thinking like, man, I need to get another room, not so I can turn up, but so I can have some peace and I can trade. And that is a transformation of a trader, right? You get a second room because you wanted peace in the beginning, or you wanted to be able to do what you wanted and have fun, etc. In Vegas, now I want to get a second room so I can actually have a place to trade just for an hour or two in peace, right? And it's like it's a crossover, right? And then my wife was like, "Man, no, just get a suite." I was like, "No, I want a whole different room." Right? So when I met Mike one time in Houston, right, he was like, "Bro, you ain't staying with your family?" Oh yeah, here's a door, and we had a door to the other room. It's like I wanted a door I can close, right? And that is part of crossing over into a trader, part of crossing over as a father, right? In the trading, is protect the capital first, right? And the father instinct first job is to protect, right? A master trader first job is risk management, right? If you blow the account, you cannot show up tomorrow, right? For your family, you want to protect them. Capital preservation is conservative. It's the highest form of aggression, right? It keeps you in the game long enough for the edge to work if you protect your capital, right? In the market and as a father, you want to surrender the need to be right, right? Just as we drop our pride when it comes to comforting a crying child, right? The professional cuts the trade the moment the thesis is invalidated. No drama, no waiting for the market to apologize. Being right is the ego's addiction. Being disciplined is the operator's edge, right? You want to zoom out to the macro, right? One bad hour ruins a week when you first started trading. And then after, you judge your execution over 100 to 500 trades, not one. You trade for the quarterly, yearly longevity, not tomorrow's dopamine. The same way that a father builds for years, not for the afternoon, right? A father don't show up and say, "Oh, I spent Saturday with you." It's like, being a father is over the years where you home, where you present. So you zoom out to the macro and you trade from identity, not emotion, right? Before a trader would feel it and they wanted to feel that rush of being successful. The after trader trades because that's simply who he is. I'm a trader. This is what I do, right? And I'm going to execute, right? And when the behavior flows from identity instead of mood, and consistency stop being right, right? I don't need to be right. I just need to follow my plan and build for a legacy, not just a lifestyle, right? The money becomes secondary. What they're really building is freedom, options, and the capacity to be present for people they love. That is where trading mastery and fatherhood mastery becomes the same thing, creating security and a possibility for those who come after you, right? And this is, part of that transformation, right? And the pain I feel is not proof I'm failing; it is proof I'm being forged. So when you're going through a painful time or a transformation, right, it's a proof of being forged into something different, right? I protect my capital the way a father protects what he loves first, without apology, right? I don't tell a person like, "Oh man, sorry I had to exit the trade," or et cetera. Same way I don't tell anyone, "Hey, oh sorry man, sorry I offended you because I had to protect my kid," right? It's un unapologetic about protecting my capital, unapologetic about protecting my family, right? And this is, certain things. So, I see it's 6 o'clock. I gotta respect the time. I can't be sorry, but I'm disciplined, and it's time for me to do my pre-market plan the same way it's time for you to do your pre-market plan. So hopefully this call is beneficial, right? Your old self can die. You can become the new trader. You can become the better father. You can become the better person. And it's okay if you have to kill off the old self, right? That's part of the forged event. That's part of the catalyst, right? And this is part of the mindset is that, yeah, you will change. You will transform. And you have to be unapologetic about becoming better, right? You don't have to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm changing, I'm growing, I'm better, I'm not, I don't want to go out, I want to do this," right? I'm trying to be the best father I can, I'm trying to be the best trader I can. And that is personal growth and that's personal transformation. And it happens whether you're a trader or a father or a mother, right? All that motherhood, fatherhood, it requires you killing off some of the old qualities and expectations. All right. On that note, I will see you guys on the inside and I'll see you guys on the call and let's get to it. Peace out.